Prosecutor mocks black woman in court, not knowing she's a Secret Service, USSS Operative. Who does she think she is? The prosecutor sneered, eyes narrowing at the woman in the back of the courtroom. Little did he know, his words would come back to haunt him. She was something far more powerful, and when her true identity was revealed, the entire courtroom was left in shock. By the end of the day, his entire case and his career were about to be turned upside down. Stick around for this incredible story, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more shocking moments like this one. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the tall windows of the E. Barrett Prettyman U.S. Courthouse in Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the marble floors. Lawyers bustled through the corridors, paralegals toted boxes of documents, and visitors shuffled through security checkpoints with anxious expressions. A hushed expectation seemed to ripple through the building, a sense that something significant was about to unfold in one of the many courtrooms contained within these stately walls. At precisely 3:45 p.m., David Miller, a soft-spoken IT specialist, sat at a long wooden table in courtroom 9C. The defendant's seat felt simultaneously cold and stifling. David wore a slightly ill-fitting suit jacket over a crisp white shirt. He was trying his best to appear calm, but his shaking hands gave away his underlying nerves. Next to him was Sarah Chun, his public defender. Sarah, a petite woman with dark hair pulled into a neat bun, exuded an air of quiet determination. She whispered calming words to her client, assuring him that justice could still be served if they pressed on with the truth. On the opposite side of the room, Michael Vance, an assistant U.S. attorney known for his unyielding approach, rustled through a stack of papers on the prosecution's table. His hair, once dark, now showed streaks of gray that lent him a veneer of seasoned gravitas. Vance was a tall, lean figure who carried himself with the self-assurance that came from a near-perfect conviction rate. He scanned the faces in the courtroom, locking eyes with Sarah, then with David, and finally letting his gaze roam over the spectators. His expression conveyed a mixture of confidence and a hint of contempt for those who dared challenge the authority of the federal government. Quietly seated among the audience was Agent Maya Johnson. She wore a stylish but understated black blazer and skirt with a subtle pin on her lapel, a pin that bore no visible insignia to the casual observer, but, to those in the know, it marked a certain affiliation. Agent Johnson's poised posture and controlled breathing suggested a composed professional, not a mere curious onlooker. She rarely glanced at her phone and never once fidgeted like the rest of the spectators. An observer might guess she was either a reporter or perhaps a colleague of the defense. In truth, she was neither. Her purpose in courtroom 9C would soon become clear, but for now, she seemed content to observe. The case, United States versus Miller, revolved around allegations that David had illegally accessed classified data stored on servers belonging to a private security contractor to the Department of Homeland Security. The prosecution's story was simple. David had stolen data for personal gain. He faced charges of conspiracy, wire fraud, and unauthorized computer access. If convicted, the penalties would be severe, potentially up to 20 years in federal prison. David maintained that he had stumbled upon anomalies in the contractor's server logs, anomalies pointing to questionable practices, maybe even corruption. He claimed that once he asked too many questions, the company's higher-ups conspired to pin the theft on him. Sarah believed in her client's innocence, but belief alone didn't win cases. She needed strong evidence, and so far, the best she had was contradictory server records and a lingering sense that something bigger was at play. On the dais, Judge Elena Ramirez presided. Her black robes contrasted with a bright red scarf looped around her neck. She was known for her fairness and her ability to maintain an orderly courtroom. Judge Ramirez had read the pretrial motions and recognized that this wasn't a routine hacking case. It involved potential national security issues and a powerful contractor with high-level federal connections. She'd urged both sides to proceed with caution in discussing any classified information. Her gavel, resting on the wooden bench, seemed symbolic of the seriousness that hovered over the proceedings. A bailiff announced the start of the afternoon session. Counsel for both sides rose as the judge entered. The tension in the air grew palpable. David glanced at his defense attorney. Sarah offered a reassuring nod. Michael Vance took a measured breath, scanning the room for potential surprises. His gaze flicked toward the woman in the back row, Agent Maya Johnson, whose expression revealed nothing. He dismissed her in a heartbeat, turning his attention to the opening remarks he was about to deliver. No one besides Sarah seemed to realize that Agent Maya Johnson was more than she appeared. Soon, Agent Johnson told herself, the truth will become impossible to ignore. Little did Michael Vance know, his condescension would be short-lived and his arrogance exposed. Michael Vance loved the thrumming energy of Washington, D.C. He saw the city as the heart of American power, a place where ambition met opportunity and where a single successful trial could skyrocket a legal career. He had arrived 15 years ago, fresh from a prestigious law school, carrying a mixture of intellectual arrogance and a genuine eagerness to prove himself. Initially, Vance toiled in the ranks of the Department of Justice, handling smaller fraud and embezzlement cases. His big break came when he exposed a large-scale Ponzi scheme implicating local businessmen with ties to city council members. That high-profile win earned him accolades and a notable mention in a local news segment. From then on, every high-stakes case seemed to fall into his lap. He swiftly ascended to the position of Assistant U.S. Attorney in the District of Columbia. Over time, Vance became known for his ruthless cross-examinations. Defendants wilted under his questions. Witnesses who stumbled even slightly were quickly discredited. Judges occasionally admonished him for aggressive tactics, but it rarely affected the outcome. Juries, in an era clamoring for accountability, found solace in Vance's brand of prosecutorial zeal. Yet, for all his brilliance, Vance cultivated blind spots. His unyielding faith in the system sometimes veered into elitism and condescension. He routinely dismissed public defenders, believing they lacked the sophistication to mount a credible defense. He had a near-automatic skepticism towards claims of systemic corruption, labeling them desperate conspiracy theories. He also harbored biases, subtle but consistent, toward people who didn't fit his mold of success. He prided himself on being above prejudice, but in hushed tones, colleagues noted his pattern of ridiculing female lawyers of color, belittling them as diversity hires. Vance would brush off such remarks, calling them locker room banter or misunderstood humor. By the time David Miller's case crossed his desk, Vance was at the peak of his career. He welcomed the challenge of a cybercrime angle. The initial evidence, server logs allegedly showing David entering restricted areas of the system, seemed robust. Though the defense insisted something was amiss in those logs, Vance placed unwavering trust in the security contractor's internal investigation, the same contractor that had flagged David as a suspect in the first place. He smelled an easy conviction, or at least a straightforward one. Behind the scenes, however, Vance also had personal motives. The higher-ups at the contractor were well-connected, and Vance had his eyes on a potential appointment to an interagency cybercrime task force. A bulletproof conviction will look great on my record, he told himself. He pictured the headlines. Prosecutor takes down rogue IT specialist in national security data theft. That was the kind of prestige that could catapult him into an even bigger role. There was only one hint of unease. An unnamed witness the defense had listed for possible testimony. Court filings referred to a private security consultant who'd allegedly discovered exculpatory evidence. Vance's staff had tried to find out more, but the defense played close to the vest. Confident in his ability to dismantle any witness, Vance shrugged off the concern. In past cases, he had seen secret experts trotted into court with evidence that quickly crumbled under his cross-examination. He assumed it would play out the same way. Perhaps if Vance had paused to wonder why the defense would fight so hard to keep the consultant's identity under wraps, he might have approached the matter more carefully. But caution was never his strong suit when he sensed a victory. As he walked into courtroom 9C that afternoon, he was already mentally rehearsing the final lines of a speech that would paint David Miller as a cunning criminal, one who had fooled people just long enough to nearly get away with it. From his vantage point at the prosecution table, Vance noticed the well-dressed black woman sitting quietly in the last row. She looked vaguely familiar, maybe from a previous trial or a DC legal event, but he couldn't place her. He dismissed the thought and returned to scanning his notes. He had no inkling that the woman he just overlooked would upend his entire case. Agent Maya Johnson was born in the heart of Detroit, Michigan, where her father served as a master sergeant in the U.S. Army's military police and her mother taught high school mathematics. From childhood, Agent Johnson absorbed two crucial lessons: discipline from her father and analytical thinking from her mother. She excelled at detective games, logic puzzles, and any academic challenge thrown her way. In high school, she was the quiet star, excelling in science and technology clubs, volunteering at local community centers, and serving on the student council. Driven by a thirst for service and understanding, she secured scholarships to attend the University of Michigan. There, she double-majored in international relations and criminology, a blend that fed her fascination with both the global stage and the intricacies of criminal behavior. She wrote her honors thesis on emerging cyber threats in international diplomacy, impressing several visiting professors who had connections in government agencies. After graduation, Agent Johnson initially considered joining the FBI, but a chance encounter at a job fair introduced her to a Secret Service recruiter. Contrary to its widespread image as purely a presidential protection detail, the Secret Service also had a robust investigative mandate, particularly around financial crimes, cyber threats, and protective intelligence. Intrigued, Agent Johnson enrolled in the agency's training program. She discovered she was a natural fit. Her patience, analytical skills, and ability to blend seamlessly into different environments made her an asset. She rose through the ranks, first as a field agent working on financial fraud cases, then taking on more specialized roles related to cybercrime. Ultimately, her superiors recognized that she possessed an exceptional aptitude for undercover work. Unlike some agents who thrived on direct confrontation, Agent Johnson excelled at the slow, methodical process of infiltration, building trust, and extracting information. Over the years, she worked on cases ranging from counterfeit currency rings to the infiltration of extremist groups planning threats against major U.S. events. Her latest assignment, initiated nearly a year before the David Miller trial, led her into the murky waters of private security contractors who held lucrative federal contracts. Rumors abounded of improper data storage, illegal intelligence gathering, and the forging of official documents to cover up wrongdoing. It was an enormous puzzle with many pieces scattered across multiple states and corporate entities. Agent Johnson methodically followed the digital footprints, the money trails, the anomalies in server logs. Each step brought her closer to confirming that at least one major contractor was systematically tampering with records and scapegoating innocent employees who stumbled onto the truth. When the name David Miller surfaced in her intel, it piqued her interest. Here was a mid-level IT specialist facing serious federal charges for hacking. Yet the deeper she looked, the less sense it made. By analyzing the logs and communications from the contractor servers, Agent Johnson suspected that David had been framed. Her mission was to gather enough ironclad evidence to expose the manipulation without jeopardizing the broader investigation. Being part of the Secret Service meant Agent Johnson had to tread carefully. If she revealed herself too soon, she could jeopardize months of covert work. If she waited too long, an innocent man might end up convicted. In consultation with her supervisors, she decided to step forward as a defense witness under careful secrecy until the trial began. She provided the defense with a fraction of her findings, enough for them to subpoena her as an expert witness. Still, no one except Sarah Chun truly understood who Agent Maya Johnson was or the scope of her credentials. The day before she walked into Courtroom 9C, Agent Johnson had a discreet meeting with Sarah in a secure conference room in the courthouse basement. Sarah had been shocked at first. "Your Secret Service?" she'd whispered, glancing at Agent Johnson's badge. But after reviewing the agent's preliminary evidence, sealed and partially redacted, Sarah's disbelief morphed into relief and cautious hope. She couldn't wait to introduce this private security consultant to the unsuspecting prosecution. Agent Johnson relished such moments of unveiling the truth. She never craved the spotlight, but she recognized the power in withholding her identity until it served her mission. Now, seated quietly at the back of the courtroom, she waited. She observed every nuance of Vance's performance. His carefully modulated voice, his barely masked disdain for the defense, and his fleeting glances at the gallery. She felt no malice, only a steely resolve to set the record straight. In less than 24 hours, she would take the stand and demonstrate the magnitude of this orchestrated conspiracy. And by doing so, she would also reveal her Secret Service affiliation, a revelation that would rattle the prosecution's confidence and alter the course of the case. For Agent Johnson, it was a necessary risk, one she was prepared to navigate. For Michael Vance, it would be a thunderclap of reality, reminding him that not all witnesses can be so easily torn apart. The first official day of the trial began early. By 8 a.m., the corridor outside courtroom 9C was bustling. David, looking anxious in a crisp gray suit, stood next to Sarah as they awaited the bailiff's signal. Sarah whispered final words of reassurance, reminding him to remain calm no matter how aggressively Vance attacked. Inside, the jury box filled up quickly. 12 jurors plus alternates, representing various professions and backgrounds, settled into their seats. Judge Ramirez entered with a measured step, robed in traditional black, an expression of impartial gravity on her face. "All rise," the clerk intoned, and the entire courtroom stood in unison. Once the judge was seated, everyone else took their places. The hush that followed was charged with anticipation. Vance opened the proceedings with his opening statement. He strode to the center of the courtroom with easy confidence, addressing the jury in a sonorous voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your service. Today, the United States will present evidence that Mr. David Miller knowingly and willfully accessed classified data belonging to a government contractor. We will show that he transferred and possessed these files outside authorized channels, thereby jeopardizing national security. This is not a minor transgression, but a deliberate crime." His tone dripped with certainty. He used phrases like "beyond a reasonable doubt" and "undeniable digital footprints," painting David as a cunning opportunist. The jurors, listening attentively, seemed impressed by Vance's polished delivery. He referenced upcoming testimony from FBI computer experts who would show how David's login credentials were used to breach sensitive systems. He concluded with a measured look at the defendant. "You will see that the evidence leaves no room for doubt as to Mr. Miller's guilt." When Sarah rose for her opening statement, her approach contrasted sharply with Vance's. She was calm, almost gentle in her tone, yet unwavering in her conviction. David Miller is not a criminal mastermind. In fact, you will hear how he discovered suspicious activity on his employer's servers, activity that pointed to wrongdoing at higher levels. Rather than engage in a cover-up, he tried to raise concerns. For this, he became the perfect target for those who did have something to hide. Her voice held a quiet passion that captured the jury's attention, even if they weren't fully convinced yet. "We will present evidence of manipulated server logs and incomplete forensic analyses, evidence that reveals an orchestrated effort to blame David for someone else's crimes." Agent Maya Johnson sat among a handful of spectators, noting the subtle shifts in the jurors' postures, the way they turned to each other after certain statements. She could see skepticism, curiosity, and latent sympathy. She also noted how Vance's eyes flicked occasionally to Sarah, as if appraising whether she was a real threat or just another public defender out of her depth. The day's testimonies began with witnesses from the private security contractor, mid-level managers, IT supervisors, and compliance officers. They spoke about the official protocols, the severity of data security measures, and how David's workstation was flagged after an unusual spike in data downloads. Each witness seemed intent on reinforcing the idea that only one person, David Miller, had the motive and the skill to orchestrate the theft. Sarah cross-examined them methodically, pointing out that the initial forensic analysis was almost entirely conducted by the contractor's own internal security team, not by an independent agency. She drew attention to potential conflicts of interest and the possibility that the logs could have been tampered with before they were handed over to the FBI. Still, the effect was muted. The contractor's employees stuck to their talking points. Around midday, FBI Special Agent Davis, a digital forensics specialist, testified. He explained how the agency followed the leads provided by the contractor, analyzing the logs that indicated unauthorized access. He acknowledged that the FBI had not physically seized the servers, relying instead on images and clones provided by the contractor itself, an unusual choice, but not entirely unheard of in high-security environments. Sarah pressed him on the chain of custody for the evidence, but Davis insisted the process was handled with standard procedure. By the afternoon recess, David looked drained, as though each new witness chipped away at his hope. Sarah conferred with him quietly, promising that they still had a plan for their own key witness. Agent Johnson watched them, her own heart heavy with empathy, though she maintained her calm facade. Vance, meanwhile, seemed increasingly self-assured. He lightly joked with his prosecutorial team, certain that the jury found the contractor's witnesses credible. From his perspective, Sarah's questions had done little to undercut the fundamentals of the prosecution's case. He barely spared Agent Johnson a glance as he headed to lunch, She was just another anonymous spectator in the gallery, after all. The day ended with no bombshell revelations. Judge Ramirez dismissed the jury for the evening, cautioning them not to discuss the case with anyone. David, accompanied by Sarah, left the courthouse with his head bowed. The media outside asked pointed questions. Is your client planning to plead out? Does he have any regrets? All of which Sarah politely declined to answer. Agent Johnson slipped away quietly, blending with the departing crowd. Her mind churned with the knowledge that the real impact would come the next day when she took the stand and forced the entire courtroom to confront the possibility that the evidence against David was a house of cards. If Vance recognized the storm that was brewing, he gave no outward sign. That evening, Sarah Chin sat in a dimly lit corner of her cluttered office. Legal briefs, depositions, and printouts of digital logs covered every inch of her desk. The overhead fluorescent light buzzed softly, giving the room a faint hum that only added to the sense of tension. David Miller was seated opposite her, a takeout coffee growing cold in his hands. She read over a series of bullet points. Tomorrow, she said, glancing at David, I'll call our expert witness. She hesitated to mention Agent Maya Johnson by name, still concerned about confidentiality. She's going to testify that the logs provided to the FBI show signs of tampering. If the jury believes her, it changes everything. David pressed his lips together. I've been telling everyone the logs aren't right, he said, his voice trembling with frustration. All the IT guys at the contractor place kept acting like I was just incompetent. I wasn't trying to hack anything. I know, Sarah said gently, but convincing a jury that a big, well-funded contractor is forging evidence is not easy. We have to show them exactly how it happened and why. Otherwise, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. David set the coffee aside. If she's as good as you say, maybe tomorrow's the turning point. Sarah attempted a reassuring smile. She's better than good. She understands the system inside and out. What she couldn't say, due to the hush-hush nature of it all, was that this woman was actually a Secret Service agent. Sarah had to keep that detail under wraps until they were in open court, where Vance couldn't quietly sabotage the witness behind the scenes. Meanwhile, across town, in a high-rise apartment, Michael Vance stood by a large window, phone in hand. The bright lights of the city glimmered below him like a tapestry of tiny stars. He was speaking to a contact within the security contractor. Relax, he said in clipped tones. We have a strong case. She can't prove tampering if it never happened. His contact hesitated, voice crackling over the line. But there's something about this new witness. No one in our circles can identify who she is or where she came from. Vance rolled his eyes. Look, I've handled cases where the defense conjures some cyber guru to cry foul play. I dismantle them every time. The logs are legitimate. He ended the call more brusquely than he intended, a flicker of unease in his mind. He told himself it was just an annoyance, some obscure expert looking to grab the spotlight in a high-profile case. He sank into a leather armchair, reviewing the day's events in his head. Conflicts of interest? Nonsense, he thought. We're the United States government. We don't rely on bogus logs. He'd convinced himself thoroughly that the contractor's internal security was beyond reproach. Not far away, in a secure government facility, Agent Maya Johnson typed up her final notes. She had cross-checked data, consolidated evidence, and prepared her official statement, carefully redacting any ongoing aspects of her broader investigation. She knew precisely which details the judge would allow and which she had to keep confidential. Her agency superiors had signed off on the plan, instructing her to reveal her affiliation only under direct questioning in court. The element of surprise was crucial. Tipping off the prosecution too soon could compromise not only the immediate case, but ongoing inquiries into corruption at the contractor. Agent Johnson also contemplated the personal risks. Revealing herself as a Secret Service agent in open court could thrust her into the public eye. Media coverage might disrupt her next assignments or expose her to retaliation from the very organizations she was investigating. Despite the risks, she felt a moral obligation to see this through. David Miller doesn't deserve to go to prison for someone else's crimes, she told herself. All three actors, Sarah, Vance, and Agent Johnson, spent a restless night. Each believed the next day's proceedings would be critical. Each held different expectations about how it would unfold. For Sarah, it was a chance to change the narrative and save an innocent man. For Vance, it was just another final nail in the coffin of a hapless defendant he was certain was guilty. For Agent Johnson, It was the culmination of months of painstaking work and the moment to expose a festering corruption that extended far beyond one defendant. The second day of the trial dawned with a drizzle that dripped off the edges of umbrellas outside the courthouse. A modest crowd of reporters gathered, sensing that something big might be brewing, yet unsure what it could be. Inside courtroom 9C, the atmosphere was tense but orderly. Sarah looked focused, flipping through documents at the defense table. Vance exchanged quiet words with a junior prosecutor. David sat grim-faced, aware that the day's testimony might decide his fate. After a few procedural matters and a brief recollection of the previous day's events, Sarah stood and announced, "Your Honor, the defense would like to call Ms. Maya Johnson to the stand." A subtle ripple of movement passed through the audience, a few heads turning, but no one recognized the name. The bailiff opened the door, and Agent Maya Johnson entered. She looked confident yet reserved, dressed in a trim navy suit with a silk blouse. She stepped onto the witness stand, placed a hand on the Bible, and was sworn in. Vance leaned back in his chair, arms folded. So this is the big surprise, he thought. A well-dressed consultant. Piece of cake. He prepared for a routine cross-examination, certain he could puncture any claim she might offer. Sarah began her direct examination calmly. "Ms. Johnson, can you please state your occupation and credentials for the record?" Agent Johnson replied in a level voice. "I'm a private consultant specializing in cybersecurity. I have a background in digital forensics and risk assessment." Vance allowed himself a small sneer. Vague, he mentally noted. She doesn't even mention degrees or formal titles. He planned to exploit that if given the chance. Sarah brought up a series of screen captures, the contested server logs, projected onto a large monitor. They showed rows of timestamps, user IDs, and session details. Sarah circled several lines with a laser pointer. "Ms. Johnson, what stands out about these particular entries?" Agent Johnson leaned forward, the overhead light reflecting off her neat, braided hair. "These entries have duplicative metadata, which suggests they were manually inserted. Additionally, the digital signature fields, normally unique for each login session, are repeated, indicating potential tampering." A flicker of interest crossed the jurors' faces. They studied the projected logs more closely, some looking perplexed, others intrigued. Agent Johnson continued to explain how a typical system would never produce identical digital signatures across different times unless it was manipulated. She walked them through the concept of checksum anomalies, explaining in layman's terms that these checksums act like fingerprints. If two logs have identical fingerprints, something is off. Sarah turned to the jury, summarizing. "So, in your professional opinion, these logs were altered to suggest that Mr. Miller accessed servers at times when he did not?" Agent Johnson nodded. "That's correct. The anomalies consistently correlate to times that Mr. Miller was accounted for elsewhere, according to time-stamped security camera footage and employee key card logs." She gestured to a new exhibit that contained images from the contractor's own ID swipe system, showing David in a different building at the exact moment the logs claimed he was hacking the server. Vance's lips curled ever so slightly. He couldn't wait any longer. "Objection, Your Honor." He rose, buttoning his suit jacket. "Ms. Johnson is offering a forensic analysis that contradicts the official findings of the FBI's Digital Forensic Unit. I'd like an opportunity to cross-examine her on her qualifications." Judge Ramirez noted the tension. Sustained. The prosecution may cross-examine after the defense has finished establishing foundation. Sarah turned back to Agent Johnson, offering a gentle nod. "Ms. Johnson, can you also speak to any pattern you might have noticed in the corporate structure or in the logs that indicates a motive for framing my client?" Agent Johnson paused, choosing her words carefully. "I've observed that certain high-level employees at the contractor had significant incentives to conceal irregularities in their internal security protocols. Mr. Miller was raising legitimate concerns about system vulnerabilities. Their reaction, based on what I've seen, was to target him." Vance's expression darkened. He'd heard enough. "Your Honor, I believe we've established enough background. May I proceed with cross-examination?" Judge Ramirez allowed it, turning to Sarah. The defense attorney had laid out the core of Agent Johnson's testimony without revealing her true status. Now it was time for Vance to launch his assault. He marched toward the witness stand with a practiced stride, a legal pad in hand. "Ms. Johnson," he began, voice dripping with condescension, "could you please inform the court of your formal education in digital forensics? Exactly which certifications do you hold?" Agent Johnson met his gaze evenly. I have completed specialized training programs, both within government agencies and through accredited institutions. And which agencies would those be? Vance pressed, feigning politeness. The FBI? The NSA? Or are you simply an independent contractor with no recognized credentials? Because we haven't heard you mention a single official body that authorized your work. Sarah stiffened, sensing the trap. He wants her to say Secret Service prematurely. She shot Agent Johnson a warning glance, but Agent Johnson seemed poised. Mr. Vance, Agent Johnson replied. I can speak more specifically about my affiliations if directed by the court. However, some aspects of my background are protected by ongoing investigative protocols. Vance let out a short, dismissive laugh. Ongoing investigative protocols. This is a federal criminal trial, Ms. Johnson. We don't have time for cloak and dagger theatrics. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, the defense's witness is withholding critical information about her qualifications. Judge Ramirez looked to Sarah. Counsel, can you clarify Ms. Johnson's background? Sarah stepped forward. Your Honor, Ms. Johnson's qualifications are extensive, but due to the sensitive nature of her work, we filed a motion in chambers this morning requesting permission for Ms. Johnson to reveal her agency affiliation under seal unless the prosecution insists on open court disclosure. Vance's eyebrows shot up. He hadn't expected that. Judge Ramirez frowned slightly, recalling the private motion. She turned to Agent Johnson. Ms. Johnson, do you wish to reveal your affiliation to the court and to the public record? Agent Johnson steadied herself. This was the moment. Yes, Your Honor, I do. I believe it's necessary for the credibility of my testimony. Vance smirked. By all means, enlighten us. Agent Johnson inhaled, glancing around the silent courtroom. My name is Special Agent Maya Johnson of the United States Secret Service, assigned to a specialized division focusing on cybersecurity and protective intelligence. A collective gasp spread through the gallery. Journalists hurriedly scribbled in their notepads. Jurors exchanged astonished looks, some leaning forward as if to catch every word. Even Judge Ramirez's posture shifted slightly in surprise. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches in an instant. Vance's face went from smug to stunned in less than a second. His cheeks reddened. The polished stoicism he had displayed all morning cracked. Secret Service? He managed. Since when does the Secret Service? Agent Johnson cut him off softly. We handle far more than presidential protection, Mr. Vance. A large part of our mandate involves investigating cyber and financial crimes. For the past several months, I have been conducting an investigation into irregularities at the contracting firm in question. David Miller was flagged during this operation, but the evidence I gathered indicated he was not the perpetrator. Rather, he was being set up. Vance opened his mouth, but couldn't form a coherent question. He glanced at his junior prosecutor, who looked equally dumbfounded. Judge Ramirez rapped her gavel once, calling the room to order. The court will recess briefly, she announced. I will confer with counsel in chambers. Jury, do not discuss the case. The bailiff directed the jurors out. People in the gallery erupted into hushed conversations, while Vance stood there, caught in a swirl of shock. Sarah led Agent Johnson away from the stand, giving her a nod of gratitude. In that moment, it was clear the entire trajectory of the trial had changed. The next few hours would determine whether David Miller went free or whether the system would allow arrogance and hidden agendas to bury the truth. But at least now, the playing field was level, and Vance, who had brazenly mocked Agent Johnson, found himself facing a Secret Service operative with the weight of federal authority behind her, an authority that could not easily be dismissed as mere speculation or fringe expertise. Judge Ramirez's private chambers were spacious yet sparsely decorated, conveying a sense of both authority and minimalism. The walls were lined with law books, and a large window overlooked a courtyard where a few trees stood in the rain. Seated around a polished oak table were Judge Ramirez, Sarah Chun, Michael Vance, and Agent Maya Johnson. What is going on here? Judge Ramirez asked calmly but firmly, directing her question at the attorneys. I was aware of the sealed motion, Ms. Chun, but I did not expect a Secret Service agent to testify about systemic corruption. Sarah cleared her throat. Your Honor, I filed the motion in part because Agent Johnson's official involvement in an ongoing investigation is highly sensitive. However, we felt it was crucial to bring her forward to protect an innocent man. Vance looked visibly shaken. I object to this entire situation, he said, his voice tense. We had no prior notification of a Secret Service operative investigating the same contractor. This changes the complexion of the case entirely. If she's working under an official capacity, then we need time to review her investigative files. Agent Johnson responded softly, but with an undercurrent of steel. My agency has provided me limited clearance to present evidence specifically related to Mr. Miller's innocence. Some aspects remain classified, but the core of my investigation regarding fraudulent server logs is available for the court. Judge Ramirez massaged her temple. We're at a crossroads. On one hand, the defense has the right to present exculpatory evidence. On the other, the prosecution needs a fair chance to review it. We must balance the public's interest in an open trial with the security concerns of the Secret Service. Vance seized on the judge's mention of fairness. Your Honor, I request a mistrial, or at minimum, a postponement. The prosecution was blindsided, and we cannot effectively cross-examine Agent Johnson or verify her claims without proper discovery. Sarah shook her head. A mistrial would be an injustice to my client, who's been in legal jeopardy for months. Agent Johnson has the relevant logs and analyses ready to be submitted. The prosecution can't claim ignorance forever. They had every opportunity to investigate the logs themselves. Agent Johnson watched the exchange, measuring Vance's frustration. She knew from her training that oppressive arrogance often masked fear of losing or of being exposed. The contractor's questionable practices might implicate certain individuals who were close to Vance's circle. Judge Ramirez took a long breath. Here's how we'll proceed. I will allow Special Agent Johnson's testimony under controlled parameters. The prosecution will have a short recess, let's say overnight, to review any relevant documents she provides. Tomorrow, we resume, but I will not grant a mistrial without more compelling reasons. Vance's jaw clenched. He looked ready to protest, but something in the judge's eyes warned him not to push too far. He settled for a curt nod. Then I expect complete transparency from Agent Johnson. I won't accept any classified excuses for withholding crucial evidence. Agent Johnson maintained her composure. I will provide all permissible documentation, Mr. Vance. But I must withhold details that pertain to ongoing national security investigations. The tension in the small room was palpable. Judge Ramirez broke the stalemate. We're done here. Let's return to open court to inform the jury that we'll be adjourning early today. Tomorrow, Agent Johnson will continue her testimony, and the prosecution will have an opportunity for a full cross-examination. Everyone stood. Vance left quickly, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Sarah lingered a moment, her eyes meeting Agent Johnson's. Thank you, she said softly. David's life is hanging in the balance here. Agent Johnson nodded. I know. We'll do everything by the book. A few minutes later, back in courtroom 9C, Judge Ramirez addressed the jurors, explaining that unforeseen complications required them to reconvene the next day. As the courtroom emptied, a buzz of conversation filled the hallways. Word had already spread that a Secret Service agent was involved. Reporters pounced on bystanders, collecting statements filled with confusion or speculation. At the defense table, David gripped Sarah's hand with gratitude and relief. The sense that a higher power within the federal government had come to confirm his story was overwhelming. For so long, he had felt like a mouse in a trap. Now, at least, an agent of the same system that prosecuted him was stepping forward to say, wait, this man might be innocent. On the other side of the aisle, Vance's junior prosecutors typed furiously on their phones, likely sending frantic messages to superiors and colleagues. The arrogance in Vance's posture seemed to waver, replaced by a grim determination. Tomorrow, he would try to discredit Agent Maya Johnson, even if she was a Secret Service operative. He'd do whatever it took to avoid a catastrophic loss. For Agent Johnson, the day was far from over. She had to finalize the evidence packet for the prosecution's review and file an official briefing with her supervisors at the Secret Service. Yet she felt a quiet satisfaction. A door had opened, allowing the truth to enter. Now it was a matter of guiding it through the corridors of justice without letting it be twisted or buried. Leaving the courthouse, she stepped into a light drizzle. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a mosaic of power and ambition. Tomorrow, she thought, we shine a light on those who abuse that power. She welcomed the challenge. Morning broke over the Capitol with an unexpected burst of sunshine piercing through the remnants of the previous day's rain clouds. The sidewalks glistened, and a crisp chill punctuated the air. By 8:30 a.m., The benches in courtroom 9C were nearly full. Word had spread. A Secret Service agent was about to unveil evidence challenging the government's case against David Miller. Journalists jostled for prime seating, while curious onlookers, including some law students and retired attorneys, lined the walls. The bailiff called the session to order. Judge Ramirez, looking resolute, asked the defense to recall its witness. Agent Maya Johnson stepped forward once again, swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Vance stood, wearing a slightly rumpled suit, a sign of a restless night. Agent Johnson, he said, foregoing any hint of cordiality, I've had a chance to review the materials you provided. They're heavily redacted. Entire paragraphs are blacked out, references to parties are omitted, and pages are missing. How can the prosecution conduct a proper cross-examination with these incomplete documents? Agent Johnson met his stare, her voice steady. Those redactions are necessary to protect ongoing investigations. However, the sections related to the allegations against Mr. Miller, the manipulated server logs, the timeline of logins, and the financial incentives within the contractor are intact and available. He glanced at the jury. So you say? But we have no way of knowing whether the redacted sections would contradict your conclusions, do we? Judge Ramirez interjected, her tone firm. Mr. Vance, you had the opportunity to present your objections in chambers. Agent Johnson, please proceed with your testimony on how these logs were allegedly altered. Agent Johnson clicked a button on a device, projecting a new set of exhibits on the courtroom's large overhead screen. They contained screenshots of the contractor's internal communications, email threads, and code segments. She walked the jury through each one, explaining in accessible language how the structure of digital timestamps and checksums should look if properly maintained. She then highlighted the abnormalities, repeated signature blocks, conflicting time zones, and missing encryption markers. It's almost as if you have 3 puzzle pieces from 3 different puzzles, she noted, and someone tried to jam them into one picture to point at Mr. Miller. The anomalies were blatant to me, but only because I approached the logs with an investigative eye. The contractor's internal team labeled these inconsistencies as glitches. However, they correlate more strongly to manual editing than to any random glitch. Vance cleared his throat. You're aware the FBI's forensic team found no evidence of tampering? Agent Johnson looked at him calmly. The FBI's analysis was based on data images provided by the contractor itself. If the contractor had already modified the logs before handing them over, the FBI's tools would show the same anomalies unless the FBI specifically looked for them. But according to the reports, the FBI performed a standard analysis. They did not suspect foul play, so they weren't investigating the possibility of altered data. The impetus for that suspicion came from my own broader investigation into the contractor's activities. To drive her point home, Agent Johnson displayed an internal memo from the contractor referencing a need to correct certain log entries before final submission to law enforcement. The language was vague, but it strongly suggested that the logs had been doctored to support a particular narrative. The jurors leaned forward in their seats. Even those who struggled with technical jargon seemed to grasp the main idea. The logs might have been manipulated to frame David Miller. A few cast sidelong glances at David, who tried not to look too hopeful lest he jinx the positive momentum. Vance, determined to fight back, took a deep breath. Agent Johnson, you claim you've been investigating the contractor for months. Can you produce any direct evidence, unredacted, that implicates specific individuals in forging the logs? She shook her head slightly. Not unredacted, no. The ongoing investigation involves multiple federal agencies and touches upon national security matters beyond this courtroom scope. But I can affirm under oath that my unit has gathered sufficient evidence to suspect intentional alteration of system logs, with Mr. Miller being used as a scapegoat. Vance pivoted, his frustration obvious. So we just have to take your word for it? How convenient. Agent Johnson's posture didn't waver. If you'd like to challenge my credibility, you are welcome to contact my supervisors at the Secret Service. They will confirm my position and the nature of my assignment. I'm testifying here because we have reason to believe a grave injustice is occurring. Vance pressed on with a barrage of technical questions, trying to corner Agent Johnson or trip her up. Each time, she offered concise, confident responses, leaning on her specialized training. Sarah's gaze flicked between Agent Johnson and the jury, gauging the impact. She could tell the jury was intrigued and increasingly inclined to believe that David might indeed be innocent. Finally, Vance hammered the motive angle. Why would a large contractor with a sterling reputation risk fabricating evidence to frame a low-level IT specialist? Agent Johnson looked to the judge, who nodded for her to answer. Because Mr. Miller discovered vulnerabilities in the contractor's data storage system that could expose them to government penalties or contract terminations. My investigation suggests these vulnerabilities were linked to more extensive wrongdoing, perhaps even misappropriation of funds or violation of data handling regulations. By framing Mr. Miller as a rogue hacker, the contractor diverts blame from its systemic flaws. A hush fell across the courtroom. This was more than a minor oversight. It sounded like a major conspiracy. Vance's face was stony as he concluded, "No further questions at this time, Your Honor." Rachel seized the moment, rising for a brief redirect. "Agent Johnson, in your professional opinion, is there enough evidence here to exonerate Mr. Miller of the charges against him?" "Yes," Agent Johnson replied without hesitation, her voice clear and sure. "Based on my experience, these logs are tampered. I see no legitimate evidence that Mr. Miller engaged in unauthorized access. My conclusion is that Mr. Miller is not guilty of the charges against him." Those final words, "not guilty," seemed to echo in the silent courtroom. The jurors absorbed them, exchanging meaningful glances. Sarah felt her heart swell with cautious optimism. David blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears of relief. Judge Ramirez dismissed Agent Johnson from the stand, and she returned to her seat. Vance sank into his chair, massaging his temples. The day's session ended soon after, leaving the prosecution scrambling to figure out how to salvage a case that now looked compromised. The defense had found not just a plausible explanation, but a credible federal agent to present it. As Agent Johnson stepped out of the witness box, she locked eyes briefly with Vance. For a moment, she almost pitied him, recognizing that arrogance can sometimes be a fragile defense mechanism. But she resolved not to let pity deflect from her mission, ensuring the truth came to light. Outside the courtroom, the corridor buzzed with talk of the Secret Service operative who had dropped a bombshell. Reporters rushed to glean any details, but Agent Johnson declined all interviews, citing the sensitivity of her role. David, overwhelmed, managed a small statement proclaiming his innocence and gratitude before Sarah guided him into a private elevator. The trial was nearing its climax. The next day would bring closing arguments, jury deliberations, and potentially a verdict. While the wheels of justice turned, the specter of the contractor's alleged wrongdoing, now partially brought to light, hung over the proceedings like a gathering storm. The final day of the trial arrived, marked by a tension so thick it seemed to compress the very air in courtroom 9C. Spectators arrived even earlier, jockeying for seats near the front. The media presence had grown significantly overnight. Camera crews and reporters from local stations and national outlets crowded the courthouse steps, hoping for a statement or a hint of the outcome. Inside, Sarah Chun and David Miller stood side by side, reviewing notes for their closing argument. David looked a mixture of anxious and hopeful. Sarah's face was set with a fierce determination to deliver the best summation of her career. Across the aisle, Vance conferred in a hushed tone with his team, the lines on his forehead testifying to the immense pressure he felt to salvage the case. Once the jury filed in, Judge Ramirez signaled Sarah to proceed with her closing statement. She stepped to the center of the courtroom. Her voice, though quiet, carried an unwavering certainty. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, "over the past few days, you have witnessed extensive testimony, reviewed technical logs, and heard from both private contractor employees and a special agent of the United States Secret Service. You have heard how the digital evidence presented by the prosecution may have been tampered with, logs altered to point blame at Mr. Miller. Ask yourselves why a reputable contractor would do this. The answer is motive, to protect themselves, their profits, and possibly more serious wrongdoing." She paused, letting her words sink in. David Miller was a convenient scapegoat, a man who refused to stay silent when he saw potential malpractice. The question before you is whether the government has truly met the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I submit that it has not. The forensic anomalies Agent Johnson highlighted cast grave doubt on the key evidence against Mr. Miller. You have the power and the responsibility to recognize these doubts and find Mr. Miller not guilty. Sarah returned to her seat, The jury seemed attentive, some nodding slightly. Judge Ramirez then turned to Vance, granting him the opportunity for his own closing argument. He stood, walked to the center, and took a breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, in a voice that strove for confidence. Though an undercurrent of strain was evident, the defense wants you to believe in an elaborate conspiracy, one in which a multi-million-dollar contractor risks its entire reputation to frame a single IT specialist. Meanwhile, the FBI's forensic team, with all its expertise, supposedly overlooked tampered logs. I urge you to consider which scenario is truly more plausible: that Mr. Miller was found accessing data he had no right to see, or that an entire corporate entity fabricated logs at great personal risk just to protect some unnamed wrongdoing. He glanced at the jury with a grave expression. Agent Johnson's testimony is compelling, I won't deny that. But we must also acknowledge that her investigative records are partially classified. We cannot see everything she's working on. We must rely on her word, and that is not how a court of law functions. We rely on clear, verifiable evidence, not indefinite references to hush-hush investigations. Therefore, I ask you to return a verdict consistent with the actual evidence presented, the evidence that shows Mr. Miller's login credentials were used to access these files, the same evidence that led the FBI to confirm unauthorized data breaches. Thank you. One crisp autumn morning, months after the trial, the Washington Post ran a small article buried on page A7. The headline read, "Justice Department investigates alleged contractor fraud. Internal review of prosecutor underway." The piece noted that federal investigators had opened a probe into several employees of the contractor for possible evidence manipulation, financial misreporting, and other irregularities. It also mentioned administrative actions against an assistant U.S. attorney, though it did not name Michael Vance directly. While the details remained murky, the article confirmed what Agent Johnson had testified to in court. Wrongdoing had occurred at high levels, and David Miller had been wrongly targeted. The legal system, though imperfect, had managed this time to self-correct, thanks in no small part to a defense attorney's tenacity and the principled intervention of a dedicated Secret Service agent. In a secure facility across town, Agent Maya Johnson skimmed the article while drinking her morning coffee. A small, satisfied smile touched her lips. She had new assignments now, fresh responsibilities that demanded her full attention, but she allowed herself a moment to reflect on the Miller case. In a world rife with hidden motives and clandestine deals, every victory for justice felt significant. Agent Johnson set the paper aside, gathered her files, and stepped into the hallway to continue her work. She could still recall Michael Vance's face when she revealed her credentials in open court. The shock, the anger, the grudging realization that the nobody he mocked was one of the very guardians of the federal system he claimed to uphold. Arrogance had met its match. Truth, backed by integrity and the force of law, had triumphed this time. There would always be new battles, new illusions to pierce, but the memory of one federal courtroom in D.C. served as a reminder of how a seemingly invincible facade can crumble under the weight of undeniable facts. And so it was written, "Prosecutor mocks black woman in court, not knowing she's a Secret Service, USSS Operative." A cautionary tale about the hubris of power and the enduring resilience of truth. In the end, justice prevailed. The prosecutor, once so certain of his victory, was left speechless as the truth unraveled before his eyes. David Miller walked out of that courtroom a free man, and the woman he had mocked, she was the one who had exposed the corruption he refused to see. This story is a powerful reminder that arrogance can blind even the most powerful, but the truth always has a way of coming to light. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more eye-opening stories like this one. See you in the next video.